On October 24, 1944, Lieutenant Yukio Seki climbed into the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter for the last time. Strapped beneath the aircraft was a 250-kilogram bomb. He would not be returning. Before takeoff, he handed a bundle of letters to his commanding officer, 127 in total, written over the previous 2 weeks. 126 were addressed to family, friends, and his wife. The final letter had no address. It was never meant to be sent. In it, Seki wrote the truth he couldn't tell anyone else. This is the story of Japan's kamikaze pilots told not through propaganda or military history but through the words they left behind. It's a story of young men, most barely 20 years old, who wrote farewell letters, knowing they would die within days or hours. It's a story of what those letters revealed about fear, duty, love, and the reality behind the mythology of the divine wind. The word kamikaze translates literally as divine wind, referring to typhoons that destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century. When Japan adopted this term for suicide attacks in October 1944, they invoked divine protection and historical precedent. But the reality behind the mythology was far different from the propaganda. By late 1944, Japan was losing the war catastrophically. American forces had recaptured the Philippines. The combined fleet had been shattered at Leyte Gulf. B-29 superfortresses were beginning their campaign against the home islands. Most critically, Japan was running out of experienced pilots. Training programs that once took 2 years were compressed to 6 months, then 3, then weeks. New pilots arrived at combat units with minimal flying time and almost no combat training. The mathematics of aerial warfare had become brutal for Japan. An experienced American fighter pilot in a superior aircraft, the F-6F Hellcat, or P-51 Mustang, would shoot down inexperienced Japanese pilots with depressing consistency. Conventional attacks by poorly trained pilots against heavily defended American ships achieved almost nothing. Most attacking aircraft were shot down before reaching their targets. Those that broke through rarely inflicted significant damage with bombs or torpedoes that often missed. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, calculated a grim arithmetic in October 1944. If 10 inexperienced pilots attacked conventionally, perhaps one might hit a ship, and that ship might survive the hit. If 10 pilots loaded their aircraft with bombs and deliberately crashed into ships, 7 or 8 would be shot down, but the remaining 2 or 3 would strike their targets, and those ships would likely sink. The conclusion seemed logical. Suicide attacks were more efficient than conventional ones. This logic ignored the human cost. It ignored what it meant to order young men to deliberately die. It ignored the psychological impact on pilots waiting their turn, and it ignored what these young men actually thought about their missions, thoughts they recorded in letters they knew would be read after their deaths. Lieutenant Yukio Seki was 23 years old in October 1944. He had graduated from the Naval Academy at Etajima, Japan's equivalent of Annapolis, in 1941. He was a skilled pilot with over 1,000 flying hours. He had survived 2 years of combat in China and the South Pacific. He was recently married to a woman named Mariko, whom he loved deeply. He had every reason to want to live. When Vice Admiral Onishi personally requested that Seki lead the first organized kamikaze attack, Seki could have refused. Officers of his rank sometimes could decline suicide missions without official repercussions, but the social pressure was immense. To refuse would mean dishonor, not just for himself but for his family. His father, a teacher, would face ostracism. His wife would be shamed. His younger brother, serving in the army, would be marked as related to a coward. Seki accepted the mission. Then he began writing letters. The first letter was to his wife Mariko. He had married her just months before in February 1944, during a brief leave. They had known each other for less than a year. Their time together as a married couple totaled perhaps 6 weeks spread across several leaves. The letter began formally as Japanese custom required, then became increasingly personal. My dearest Mariko, by the time you read this, I will have completed my final mission. I want you to know that my last thoughts were of you. I regret deeply that we had so little time together. I regret that we will not grow old together as we planned. I regret that I will not see your face again. He continued for several pages, describing memories of their brief time together, expressing love in terms that would have been considered too intimate for Japanese cultural norms. He wrote about his hopes for her future, urging her to remarry and not waste her life mourning him. He included practical advice about finances and dealing with military bureaucracy to claim his death benefits. Then, In the final paragraph, the formal tone cracked. I am afraid. I know I should not admit this, but you deserve truth from me. I am 23 years old and I do not want to die, but I've accepted this mission because I could not refuse without bringing shame to you and our families. I hope you can forgive me for not being braver. This letter would not be delivered to Mariko for 3 months. Military censors held all Kamikaze letters until after the pilot's death was confirmed, then reviewed them for defeatist content. Seki's admission of fear was borderline unacceptable, but the censors ultimately allowed it, perhaps moved by his obvious devotion to his wife. Seki wrote 23 letters to family members. To his father, a lengthy letter explaining that he died with honor fulfilling his duty. To his mother, a shorter, more emotional letter expressing love and gratitude for her sacrifices raising him. To his younger brother, advice about life, career, and surviving the war. To aunts, uncles, cousins, formal letters expressing farewell and gratitude. Each letter followed Japanese epistolary conventions precisely. Each began with appropriate seasonal greetings and inquiries about the recipient's health. Each ended with formal closing phrases. Between these cultural bookends, Seki included personal messages that revealed his actual thoughts and feelings. To his father, I fulfill this duty not out of hatred for the enemy or love of war, but because it is what is required of me. I hope you understand that I go to my death not willingly but dutifully. To his brother, you must survive this war. Japan will need men like you to rebuild. Do not throw your life away foolishly. There is no glory in meaningless death. To a cousin who is also a pilot, if you receive orders like mine, remember that you fly not for the Emperor or the Empire, but for the families who wait for us at home. That is the only meaning that matters. These letters revealed a man who was ambivalent about his mission, who loved his family desperately, who wanted to live but felt trapped by duty and honor. They contradicted every propaganda image of the eager kamikaze pilot joyfully sacrificing himself for the Emperor. Seki wrote 74 letters to fellow pilots and friends. Some were brief notes of farewell, others were lengthy reflections on their shared experiences. One letter to an academy classmate who had survived being shot down twice included this passage. You have fought bravely and survived through skill and luck. I envy you that luck. I wish I could have seen you again to drink sake and reminisce about our student days. Those seem like a lifetime ago, though it has been only 3 years. To another friend he wrote with unusual bitterness. The Americans have unlimited aircraft and pilots. We have brave men flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate training. We are ordered to die to compensate for these deficiencies. Perhaps this is heroic. Perhaps it is simply wasteful. I am not wise enough to know which. The military censors nearly suppressed this letter, but ultimately allowed it with redactions. A surviving copy shows crossed out sections that were probably even more critical of Japanese military strategy. Seki wrote 15 letters to former teachers and mentors. These letters expressed gratitude for their instruction and guidance. They also included reflections on education, duty, and the meaning of sacrifice that suggested Seki was working through his feelings about his impending death through writing. To his primary instructor at Etajima Naval Academy, you taught us that a warrior's honor lies in how he lives as much as how he dies. I have tried to live with honor. I hope my death, though it comes through duty rather than choice, will reflect the values you taught us. To a philosophy professor, you once asked our class whether duty to the state supersedes duty to oneself and one's family. I could not answer then. I still cannot answer now. But I have made my choice, and I must live, or rather, die with it. 15 letters went to members of his flight squadron, pilots and ground crew who were his daily companions. These letters were remarkably frank about the realities of combat, the inadequacy of their equipment, and the challenges they faced. To one fellow pilot, our Zeros are worn out, the engines misfire, the radios fail, but we fly them anyway because there is nothing else. When you attack the enemy, remember that your aircraft's limitations are not your fault. Do what you can with what you have. To his crew chief, a veteran mechanic who had maintained Seki's aircraft throughout his combat tours. You have kept my Zero flying through 2 years of combat. You have saved my life countless times through your skill and dedication. I thank you for every hour you spent ensuring my engine would not fail, my guns would fire, my controls would respond. You are a true craftsman. 5 letters went to girlfriends from before he met Mariko. These were formal, proper letters expressing gratitude for past friendship and wishing them happiness in their future lives. Japanese culture would have expected these letters. To not write them would have been considered rude, even though Seki was now married and these relationships were long over. One particularly poignant letter went to a woman Seki had been engaged to before the war. That engagement had been broken when he joined the Navy and was assigned to combat duty. She had married someone else in his absence. His letter to her was gracious and kind. I hope your marriage brings you the happiness we once thought we might find together. I bear no resentment that you chose a different path. You made the wise choice. I am glad you will survive this war and live the life you deserve. The remaining letters, more than a dozen, went to various acquaintances, distant relatives, and people who had helped him at various points in his life. A landlady who had rented him a room during training, a restaurant owner who had given him credit when money was tight, a librarian who had helped him find research materials for academy papers. Each received a brief note of thanks and farewell. The systematic thoroughness of Seki's letter writing reveals something important about kamikaze pilots that propaganda obscured. They were not eager fanatics rushing to death. They were methodical, thoughtful men preparing for death as anyone might, by settling accounts, expressing gratitude, saying farewell to everyone who mattered in their lives. Writing 127 letters took Seki 2 weeks. Other pilots in his unit observed him writing for hours each day. Some joined him, writing their own farewell letters. Others avoided him, perhaps unable to face the reality his letter writing represented. Lieutenant Kiyoshi Ogawa, another pilot in Seki's unit, wrote only 3 letters, to his parents and his sister. When asked why so few, he replied, "I have already said everything I needed to say to the people I love. Writing more letters won't change what happens next." Ensign Teruo Yamaguchi wrote over 200 letters, more than Seki. He wrote to everyone he had ever known, including grade school teachers and childhood friends he hadn't contacted in years. His letter writing became obsessive, as if by writing enough letters he could delay the inevitable. These varying approaches to farewell letters revealed different psychological strategies for coping with impending death. Some pilots like Seki approached it methodically, others avoided thinking about it. A few embraced it with genuine or performed enthusiasm, but almost all left letters, because the letters served a cultural function. They provided a final connection to the world the pilots were leaving. The 127th letter, the one never meant to be sent, was different from all the others. It had no address, no recipient's name, no formal greeting. It began simply, "To whoever finds this." This letter was brutally honest in ways the others could not be. Seki wrote it knowing it would never be read by anyone who knew him, never be censored by military officials, never bring shame to his family. It was his true testament. "I do not want to die. I write this knowing that by the time anyone reads it I will be dead, so there is no point in hiding the truth. I am afraid. I do not believe this mission will change the war's outcome. I do not believe my death will accomplish anything meaningful. I was told we are the divine wind that will drive back the Americans, but we are not divine. We are men who have been ordered to die because Japan has run out of other options. Our leaders call this heroic. I call it desperate. I think about my wife constantly. We were married for such a brief time. I wanted to grow old with her. I wanted children. I wanted an ordinary life, teaching at a school perhaps, flying civilian aircraft, anything but this. But I accepted this mission because to refuse would destroy my family's honor. My father would lose his position. My wife would be ostracized. My brother's military career would be ruined. So I will die not because I want to, not because I believe it serves any purpose, but because refusing would cause more suffering than accepting. Is this courage? I don't know. It feels like cowardice, choosing death rather than facing the social consequences of refusing. But perhaps all courage is just choosing between different forms of cowardice. To whoever finds this letter, if Japan has lost this war as I believe it will, then perhaps you will understand that we were not fanatics or madmen. We were ordinary men caught in circumstances we could not control, doing what we believed we had to do to protect the people we loved. If my family ever learns of this letter, I hope they will forgive me for speaking these truths. This letter was found in Seki's personal effects after his death. It was not included with his other letters to be distributed to recipients. Japanese military censors would have destroyed it if they had found it. Instead, it survived in his footlocker until American occupation forces processed captured Japanese documents after the war. It was translated in 1948 and filed in American archives. Mariko, Seki's widow, would not learn of its existence until 1987, when a historian researching kamikaze pilots contacted her family. On October 25, 1944, Lieutenant Yukio Seki led a formation of 5 Zero fighters the Shimpu Special Attack Unit, toward the American invasion fleet off Leyte. Each aircraft carried a 250-kilogram bomb. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, Seki's unit attacked the escort carrier USS St. Lo. American accounts describe Zeros diving through intense anti-aircraft fire. 4 were shot down before reaching targets. Seki's aircraft broke through the defensive barrage and struck St. Lo's flight deck at approximately 400 kilometers per hour. The impact detonated his bomb, which in turn detonated aircraft being armed on the hangar deck. The resulting explosions and fires sank St. Lo within 30 minutes. Over 100 American sailors died. From the American perspective, this was a new and terrifying tactic. From the Japanese perspective, it was confirmation that suicide attacks could achieve results conventional attacks could not. From Seki's family's perspective, it was the moment they became a hero's family, honored and burdened by that status. Mariko received her letter from Seki in January 1945, nearly 3 months after his death. Military protocol required waiting until the Kamikaze pilot's death was confirmed and his attack assessed as successful before delivering farewell letters. Mariko was 22 years old. She had been married for 11 months. She would wear widow's black for the rest of her life. In post-war interviews, Mariko spoke about receiving the letter. I knew when I saw the envelope what it meant. I didn't want to open it because opening it would make his death final. I carried it unopened for 3 days. When I finally read it, I cried for hours. Not just because he was dead, but because of what he wrote about being afraid. He had always seemed so confident, so capable. Knowing that he was afraid too, that he didn't want to die, it made his death seem even more terrible. Seki's father received his letter in December 1944. He read it once, then placed it in a wooden box with his son's photographs and other mementos. He never read it again. When asked about it years later, he said, "My son died fulfilling his duty. That is what matters. What he thought or felt about it is between him and the gods." Seki's brother survived the war and became a teacher, as Seki had suggested in his letter. He kept his brother's letter to him framed on his study wall for 40 years. The letter included advice about teaching and life that guided him throughout his career. The letters to Seki's fellow pilots in his squadron were delivered after the war ended. By then, most of those pilots were dead. Some had been killed in kamikaze attacks. Others died in conventional combat. A few survived and received letters from dead friends describing thoughts and feelings they had been unable to express while alive. One surviving pilot, Lieutenant Naoki Okamura, received a letter from Seki describing their friendship and shared experiences. Okamura kept the letter for 60 years until his own death in 2005. In his own final letter to his children, he wrote, "I have kept Yukio's letter with me always. It reminds me that I survived when so many did not. I have tried to live a life worthy of that survival." The systematic delivery of farewell letters created a final communication network among the dead and the living. Families received letters from pilots they barely knew, expressing gratitude for small kindnesses. Teachers received letters from students describing how lessons had shaped their thinking. Friends received letters acknowledging bonds that daily life had left unspoken. These letters served another purpose. They provided the Japanese government with propaganda material. Carefully selected, heavily edited excerpts from kamikaze letters appeared in newspapers and magazines. These excerpts emphasized duty, honor, and willing sacrifice while omitting admissions of fear, criticism of strategy, or personal anguish. The contrast between what the letters actually said and how they were used publicly created tension in many families. Some families were proud to have their sons' words used to inspire others. Other families felt betrayed by the misrepresentation of their sons' true feelings. Mariko refused all requests to allow publication of Seki's letters. She kept them private for 43 years, until 1987, when she allowed a historian to read and quote from them for a book about kamikaze pilots. Her condition was that the letters be published completely and unedited, showing both the formal expressions of duty and the private expressions of fear and love. The publication of complete uncensored kamikaze letters in the 1980s and 90s created a new understanding of the suicide attacks. Rather than fanatics eagerly dying for the emperor, the letters revealed young men trapped between impossible choices: die in a futile attack or bring shame on their families by refusing. Modern Japanese historians have extensively studied kamikaze letters, analyzing thousands of them from various archives. Patterns emerge. Virtually all express some form of fear or reluctance, even when formally expressing willingness to die. Most emphasize love for family over abstract loyalty to emperor or nation. Many include practical advice about finances, property, and relationships, suggesting the writers were thinking about their family's survival after their deaths rather than abstract glory. The letters also reveal the inadequacy of the aircraft and equipment kamikaze pilots flew. Seki's letter to his crew chief mentioned mechanical problems. Other pilots wrote about engines that failed, radios that didn't work, bombs that wouldn't release. One pilot wrote, "My Zero is so worn out I wonder if I will reach the target or fall into the ocean from mechanical failure. This would be a pointless death." American and Japanese scholars have debated the effectiveness of kamikaze attacks. Statistically, approximately 19% of kamikaze aircraft reached their targets. The other 81% were shot down or missed. This seems inefficient. But compared to conventional attacks by poorly trained pilots in obsolete aircraft, which achieved hit rates below 5%, the kamikaze tactic was actually more effective at sinking ships, if not at preserving pilot lives. The human cost was staggering. Approximately 3,900 Japanese pilots died in kamikaze attacks between October 1944 and August 1945. Most were young, under 25 years old. Most were poorly trained, less than 100 hours of flight time. Most knew their missions were essentially suicidal with minimal strategic value. They went anyway because cultural pressure made refusal almost impossible. A few pilots did refuse. These men were not officially punished. Japan's military code prohibited forcing unwilling pilots into suicide attacks, but they faced social ostracism so severe that several committed suicide from shame. Refusing to die became a reason to die. Yukio Seki's 127 letters provide a window into this impossible situation. They show a man who loved life, loved his wife, wanted a future, but chose death to protect his family's honor. They show someone who understood his death would accomplish little militarily, but felt obligated to die anyway. They show the gap between propaganda and reality, between how kamikaze pilots were portrayed and who they actually were. The final unsent letter, the one Seki wrote knowing no one would read it, captured this gap most clearly. In it, he admitted fear without shame, questioned his mission's value without apology, and asked for understanding from a future reader he would never meet. That future reader was American intelligence officer named James Bradley, who translated the letter in 1948. Bradley wrote in his report, "This letter contradicts every assumption we made about kamikaze motivation. The pilot expresses no fanaticism, no joy in sacrifice, no hatred of Americans. He expresses only resignation to an outcome he cannot avoid and hope that his death will at least protect his family. This suggests kamikaze pilots were victims of their own military system as much as our sailors were victims of their attacks." Mariko, Seki's widow, lived until 2003, 59 years after her husband's death. She never remarried, though Seki's letter had urged her to do so. She said in an interview late in life, "I couldn't marry again because I never stopped being married to Yukio. His letter asking me to move on was kind but impossible to follow. I was his wife for 11 months. I have been his widow for 6 decades. That is my choice, and I am at peace with it." She kept all 127 letters, including the final unsent one, which a historian had copied for her, in a wooden chest Seki had made for her as a wedding gift. She requested they be donated to a museum after her death so that people will know that kamikaze pilots were not monsters or fanatics, but young men who loved and were loved. The museum that received the letters, the Chiran Peace Museum for kamikaze pilots in Kagoshima Prefecture, displays them alongside hundreds of other kamikaze letters. Visitors can read the words of young men facing death, words that reveal fear and courage, duty and love, resignation and defiance. These letters complicate the narrative of World War II. They don't excuse the kamikaze attacks or minimize the suffering they caused, but they humanize the pilots in ways that propaganda never did. They show that war creates impossible situations where ordinary people must make terrible choices, where duty conflicts with self-preservation, where cultural expectations demand sacrifices that seem meaningless in retrospect. Lieutenant Yukio Seki wrote 127 letters because he was a methodical man facing an unmethodical death. He wanted to leave something behind, not just formal goodbyes, but honest testimony about what he thought and felt. Most of his letters followed cultural conventions because that was required. One letter, the final, unsent one, told the truth. That truth was simple. He didn't want to die, but he saw no alternative that wouldn't cause greater suffering to people he loved. He questioned whether his death would matter militarily, but he couldn't refuse the mission. He was afraid, but he would do his duty anyway. This is not the story propaganda tells about kamikaze pilots, but it is, based on the letters they left behind, the story that most closely matches their actual experience. They were not divine winds. They were young men trapped by culture, duty, and circumstance, doing what they believed they had to do, while wishing desperately that they didn't have to do it. The 127th letter, the one never sent, ends with these words: "If anyone remembers me, I hope they remember that I loved my wife, honored my family, and tried to do my duty even when I thought it was futile. I was not a hero or a fanatic. I was just a man who ran out of choices.